We've heard this parable of the sower a lot. That invites you to maybe put away some of the stuff that you are bringing to this parable already. Often we've interpreted this parable, we've heard this parable before, and we interpret it simply as this. We ask ourselves the question, what kind of soil am I? And how do I get to become good soil? How can I, as a person who follows the life and the teachings of Jesus Christ, how can I become that good soil, that fertile soil, that produces 100-fold or 60-fold or 30-fold? I want to put some of those thoughts away, because I'm reminded this day of the title of that parable. What was the title of the parable? The parable of the sower. And I want to examine and think about and wonder about with you today, what kind of reckless farmer this sower is. Really the extravagantness of this sower. And remind ourselves again that our God is a God of extras. Our God is a God of extravagance. Our God is a God of opulence. In our first service today after worship, we had Oreo cookies. I had about 5 of them. I'm joking. I didn't, honestly. We had Oreo cookies. And all of their goodness, these are extra special Oreos because they're baseball Oreos, I guess. But all of their goodness of 2 wonderful chocolatey wafers, and then this goodness that's inside of it, right? I want to remind us today that our God is not a God of just regular Oreos, but our God is a God of double stuff. All of the extras, not just double stuff Oreos, but Oreos that are ground up in ice cream, and then they have whipped cream on the top of that ice cream, they have some fudge on the top of that, and then to top it all off, a cherry. Our God is a God of extravagance, of extras, of not just the normal. Our God is a God that has reckless love for you and for me. This last week I've been trying to repair the railing on our deck. The railing on our deck was put up, I would say, rather hastily. And I'm needing to tend to that a little bit this week. Last week I've been working on it for far too long. I'll be working on it this afternoon. In fact, if any of you want to come over and help. So I went to the local Menards or Home Depot or Lowe's, whatever it was. I think I went to all of them a number of times. And I went to the decking section of these huge stores, right? Some of you have been to these places. I think they call it the millwork section of the store. I was there and I was looking at all of the options for just the railings on a deck. And I started looking at some of the brochures, and I kind of had an idea of what I was thinking of doing. Nothing huge, nothing extravagant, but just something. Something that would hopefully keep me and my kids safe. And I picked up one of these brochures, right? Some of you have picked up these brochures before. That show just like the most incredible thing that you've ever seen. Like, there's no way that your house would ever look like this. I picked up a brochure that had these clear kind of window, they were clear glass railings, put that, right? Okay? And in the background there are like these hills, these valleys, these trees, these vineyards. I mean, it was beautiful. And if I would have gone that route, my yard certainly would have looked like hills and valleys and trees and vineyards just right out there, right? And if I would have gone that route, I'm sure that I would have had to take out a second and maybe even a third mortgage just to do like a 20-foot section out of my railing. Well, I'm standing there in the millwork section of the Home Depot, the Menards, I forget which one I was even at now. Now, my house. Because I'm not all that technically knowledge. I'm certainly not a handyman of any sort. And there were all kinds of guys that had really dirty jeans on and had sweat just pouring off their brows. Their shirts were just damp from the sweat. They had a tool belt, a tape measure, and a hammer hanging from their belt. I mean, they belonged in that section of the store. And all of the salesperson, they went right to those guys, right? They could see that I didn't belong there. They could tell that I certainly didn't know what I was doing there. They could tell that I didn't belong. I see two problems in the gospel text. The first is this. There's probably many more, but I'll talk about two. The first is this. Matthew is the guy standing in the store who doesn't belong. Matthew is a tax collector. In chapter 9, verse 9 and following, we hear of the conversion experience of Matthew. Matthew was a tax collector. Tax collectors are so bad that they are listed as extra along with sinners. Often we hear in the gospel text that we hear about sinners and tax collectors. Tax collectors are corrupt. Tax collectors are rich. Tax collectors abuse their power to get what they want for themselves. Matthew does not belong in the kingdom of God. Just like I didn't belong in that millwork section of Menards. And Matthew comes to understand that just good enough, I ended up putting up with just good enough for him, is not how God operates. Our God is a God of extra, double-stuffed, creamy goodness. Our God is a God of extravagance. God calls Matthew simply with these words. He's heading down the road into Capernaum, and he sees Matthew at the gates, and he says, "Come and follow me." And Matthew does in chapter 9, verse 9 and following. And then in chapter 13, we hear of this parable of the sower, in which we see this sower recklessly planting seed, just throwing it out there on the path and on the rocky ground, on the fertile but shallow soil, on the weedy soil, and on the good soil. The sower is just throwing the seed as if it doesn't cost anything. As if there's unlimited supply of the seed. Matthew comes to understand that God is a God of extravagance. God is a God of extra. And the problem for me, and I would imagine for many of us, is that we have come to understand God as a God of good enough. We come to understand that we're saved, we're set free from our sins, we're brought and welcomed into God's family, that we truly and really belong, that all are welcome in God's family, and we respond with something like this. Yay! Let me give you this example. Our next song is How Great Is Our God, right? And some of us will stand in just a couple minutes, and we will stand and sing, How Great Is Our God. And now some of us can't sing, and that's fine, and that's well, and that's good. But if we understand our God to be a God of extravagance, and our God to be a God of extraordinary, and our God is a God who has saved us and even know if the farmers drive the tractors anymore. It seems like the computers do all that for them so that they are to the inch. I'm not even to the inch on my railing of my deck. And these farmers are planting seeds to the half inch. And in our parable today, we see a sower just throwing seeds. Now, you would think that that sower would be specific and would find that good and fertile soil. And that's why I say that Matthew has come to understand that God is a God of extra. God is a God of extravagance. God is a God who has saved and welcomed and thrown seed of grace and love to you and me. The reality is that we're the path. We're the shallow but fertile soil. We're the soil that sprouts up quickly, and then quickly those weeds come and they choke it out. We are that soil. Very rarely are we that good and fertile soil. And God has sown seeds of faith. God has recklessly thrown His love at even us. God is a God of extravagance. God is a God that recklessly shares His love. You and me. I wonder how easily it is for us to think of our God as good enough, or deserving good enough. That in our singing, we get to a point where we say, good enough. Is that great? Good enough. In our worship, we get to a point where we say, good enough. In our serving, we get to a point where we say, okay. Convenient for me this week, not so much next week. We get to a point where we say our helping of our neighbor, when it's convenient for me, okay there. When it's not, it's good enough that I was there last time. And in our giving of our time, our talent, and our treasures, we say, good enough. And we fail to remember that our God has recklessly sown seeds of faith in us. That our God has pricelessly purchased us, not with silver or gold, our catechism says, but with Christ's holy and precious blood. And that we are called then in our serving and in our worship and in our loving, in our helping of our neighbors, to be extravagant too. Matthew responds to the call of Jesus in a really rather curious way. In Matthew 9, chapter 9, verses 10 and following, Matthew responds to the call of Jesus in a really rather curious way. Often what we'll do if the songs are pretty good and if the sermon is okay one week, we might dare to invite somebody to come to worship next week. Look at the life of Matthew. What does Matthew do? After being invited to come and to follow Jesus, Matthew throws a party. Matthew invites his fellow sinners and tax collectors over to his house. And I have to imagine that Matthew didn't just throw a party, but like threw one of these brat parties. He threw like almost a kegger, kind of a cheese party, but like a serious party for our neighborhood, for our block. And it's during that we couldn't help but live a life fully and completely consumed by the extravagant grace and love of God, by the reckless love that God has for even me and even you, that people couldn't help but ask, what's going on with you? And you'd be able to tell them yet again, I have been given a second, third, fourth, 12th chance at life. God has forgiven me, has redeemed me, has brought me to new life in Jesus Christ. I am fully forgiven of my sins and I belong. Our God is God of extra. I pray that we would live that this week and in the weeks to come. I forgot a couple things at Menards yesterday. And so last night I took my son and my daughter to Menards after supper. Ben, what was the flavor of the day? Culver's. Because we stopped at Culver's. Nestle Caramel Crunch. And it was good. I pray that you and I would live our lives, not just with one of those kid scoops of Nestle Caramel Crunch at our disposal, but with like a whole gallon of Nestle Caramel Crunch. Knowing that God has given us that incredible gift, not a gift of ice cream, but a gift of salvation. That God has recklessly given us love. That God has recklessly given us grace. And when we come forward for communion, that we would recognize that this is God's grace. And when we stand to sing how great is our God, that we will fully